of the things I've been considering since the horses first arrived is just how fit they were to be transported in the first place.
We need your support going forward so that we can stop horse smuggling and that we can make sure that these vulnerable horses are protected and action is taken against smugglers. So the 26 horses, of which you can see some of them behind us, they came in from Dover, so they were being transported to the port by a trader with the intention that they would then be exported out to Europe. When they got to the port, it was discovered that the paperwork didn't quite match the load, so some of the horses weren't declared on the paperwork, which meant that they were pulled from the port and then put into facilities while the government authorities could investigate them. And then we were contacted by the holding yard to let us know that they were there. And then after discussions, it was felt that we should really be taking them in. So they came into Hall Farm. We currently don't know that much about them, so part of what we're doing is trying to trace their history and try and trace the journey that they were on. What we do know is that some of them were sold at sale, and from then it's unclear whether or not they stayed within Great Britain or whether they travelled out via Northern Ireland and Ireland and then were imported in. We know that that's what one of the trader's drivers did, but it's very unclear at the moment whether or not the horses went with him or whether he picked them up. At some point they were all loaded onto the vehicle and then transported out to Dover. So these types of ponies, these are the ones where we're talking about the under the radar movements. Some of the ponies were not declared on the paperwork. The paperwork looked like it was compliant, and this is how they move. And we have got evidence of that, but it's bits and pieces of a jigsaw, so it's putting that together. And it leaves them vulnerable, it leaves them very open to abuse. So history can be hidden, and this can be for multiple reasons, one of which is clean passports to allow them to go to slaughter when they go abroad. It can mean that they might want to be sold on as riding ponies when they potentially are not fit for that purpose. And also, again, it's unclear in this circumstance, but these types of horses can also be used to cover other activities and subject to quite long journeys in conditions that they shouldn't be transported in poor welfare conditions. And so, in general, we're concerned for their welfare. So we know that when these ponies got to Dover, they're being transported in one lorry with a drag. But that's 26 ponies that were within that. And to follow the legislation, and obviously the legislation's there to protect their welfare, the holding yard, when they transported them up to Hall Farm, transported them up in 2 vehicles, one with drag as well. So that's one additional vehicle that they had to take them up in. And from our perspective as well, we actually think legislation doesn't go far enough from a space allowance perspective, so these ponies were in very cramped conditions.
When the transporter arrived, there were 2 large lorry loads of horses that turned up at Hall Farm, and there were a real mixture of horses on those lorries. We had everything from young colts right through to aged mares and everything in between. Now, one of the first observations we saw when we started to unload them was just how frightened all of the horses were. Regardless of their age, regardless of their type, they were clearly quite traumatised when they arrived at Hall Farm and clearly not used to being handled and led on a regular basis. Our next consideration, once the horses have been safely unloaded, is to assess the condition of the horses. It's really important that we carry out a full medical examination as soon as possible after arrival. Some of the mares that arrived at Hall Farm were clearly in foal. Some of the horses were underweight, and some of them were unlevel, verging on lame when they were first unloaded and seen walking around their new field. One of the observations our team made at Hall Farm was just how many of the horses were coughing and how many of the horses were presenting with a nasal discharge. Now, whilst these symptoms don't always direct you straight to the thought of it being an infectious disease, they are always a red flag. It is always important that if we are presented with either of these symptoms, that we get them checked out straight away. Now, one horse in particular, a little black fell pony, a little mare called Fern, approximately 14 years old, who had the cough and had the nasal discharge, also had other associated symptoms. She was choosing to take herself away from the group, she wasn't eating the hay or the grass in the field, and she was spending most of her day in the field shelter completely alone, looking quiet and quite depressed. It was at this point our vet decided that she wanted to do some nasal swabs on the horses, which could be sent away and tested to see whether there was any disease associated with the clinical signs. Unfortunately, when the swab results came back, they had identified equine influenza. This is a highly contagious disease, a disease that can be spread quite rapidly through a group of horses like the ones that had come into us from the port. Sadly, horses that are unvaccinated are more vulnerable to the disease, and because of the inconsistencies with the paperwork that was sent in with the horses, we were unable to determine which of the horses had been vaccinated, if any.
So from a disease perspective, it's very important for traceability to be able to trace back ponies, so we know where they've been in contact with other horses, so that we can then contain any disease threat. These particular ponies, as we've said, some of them, in terms of traceability side, some of them don't, they're undeclared. So, and from our perspective, we're trying to trace back that journey and where they've been. We know that some of them, as I said, were at sale, so that is a point of contact. But they will have probably been loaded and unloaded and potentially in contact with other horses. We don't know where they picked up equine influenza, so we don't know how many other horses they could have infected. The other issue is that these are ponies that are meant to have been exported over to Europe, so therefore that disease could have spread not just within GB, but abroad.
Now, fortunately, Fern proved to be a really good patient. Part of her treatment plan was to take her temperature 3 times a day and just monitor for any other clinical signs that she might present with. Fortunately, she did make a really good recovery. She did recover quite quickly.
So in terms of what we're doing to look at, to better understand the history of these ponies and to understand the movements, and from a traceability and biosecurity, but also from their identification, we're having to look at their passports, look at their microchips, try and verify that the identification matches up, and then just try and drill down in terms of where we know the journey, where we know the driver's been, where we know the trader's been, and try and identify where the horses may have journeys, and what that looks like. So it is quite challenging, because we might know that a vehicle's passed through a port, but we don't necessarily know that the horses are actually on that vehicle. They might have been declared as being on that vehicle, but unless the door's opened and it's checked that there's actually horses on there, we don't know that for certain. So it is working with local authorities, working with government agencies to try and trace those movements. So we're a few months later on, and in terms of what we now know about the horses, so we now know that one of them wasn't microchipped at all. Another one had a microchip, but it wasn't properly registered. So those two, we would say, actually are not compliant with current law. In terms of the movements of the horses, there's very little else we've managed to find out. So it's what we had thought before in terms of the movement up through Scotland into Northern Ireland, down to Ireland, and then we're imported into Wales and back through. I think we're now fairly confident the horses probably didn't make that move, but again, we'll never be absolutely certain, because we don't believe there were physical checks in Northern Ireland when the horses moved in. So in terms of actually knowing whether or not that the horses moved in, I don't think we'll ever be able to find that out. Where it's moved in terms of prosecution, unfortunately, due to the lack of information around that traceability, it made it quite challenging, but also We approached all of the local authorities that could have taken a prosecution, and none of them have wanted to take that forward, which unfortunately means in this instance that the smuggler or the trader involved will not be prosecuted, which in terms of kind of making sure that there's repercussions for their actions, it's unfortunate that this won't be taken to court and there won't be a prosecution taken. So we really need to kind of raise awareness, particularly with the new government coming into place, and make sure that they're all aware of horse smuggling and the impact that it can have on any horse that could potentially be going abroad and being moved abroad and smuggled abroad. And that will include kind of, writing to new MPs about this issue. And raising awareness of the need for better traceability and better identification laws, and also enforcement. We need to raise the fact that there needs to be 24/7 enforcement at the ports, and that they need to be resourced, and that local authorities also need to be resourced. What we do know is, and with the Dover 26, for example, that wasn't taken to prosecution. Part of that is the difficulty around tracing the movements of the horses and gathering that picture. But the other part of that is the fact that prosecutions just cost so much money, and that local authorities don't have the resource to pursue that. So they tend to not like to take cases where it's not easy and they need an awful lot of investigation work. If these steps aren't taken, then there'll be nothing to disrupt the trade. The trade will just continue. It'll be far too easy for these smugglers to continue moving horses. We say under the radar. Obviously under the radar can look like compliant paperwork, just because it's far too easy to gain compliant paperwork without actually having moved the horses, or even just undeclared movements as well, where the horses simply aren't declared, but if you're not physically checking the consignment, then you'll never know that there are additional horses on board. So it will just continue. We'll just, for the welfare of these horses, they'll continue going on long journeys, they'll continue going in poor conditions, and they'll continue potentially ending their lives in slaughterhouses, or potentially being sold on to unknowing new owners that don't know their history.
So the good news for all of the Dover 26 that came into Wild Horse Welfare Hall Farm is that we are now here to look after them and provide them with the rehabilitation, care and attention that they duly deserve. We will continue to assess them and provide what rehabilitation they require, and eventually we would like to think that we can go on to rehome each and every one of the horses. Now, there is an associated cost to rehabilitating every horse that comes into Wild Horse Welfare, and we estimate it costs about £5,000 per horse to send it through its full rehabilitation programme. Now, Wild Horse Welfare receives no government funding whatsoever, so we heavily rely on public donations and support.
As a charity, we are reliant on your donations, so we cannot do this without the support that you give to us. And the ban live exports to slaughter, which we managed to get through recently, was a fantastic win for us, and we couldn't have done that without you. And we need your support going forward to make sure that we can maintain this momentum going forward, so that we can stop horse smuggling and that we can make sure that these vulnerable horses are protected and action is taken against smugglers.